Esther.
Hi, Florian.
So a lot of stuff to go through today in SlatorPod number 4. Welcome to the by now hundreds of listeners. It's very good to see that we're getting a fair amount of traction already at the early stages of this podcast project. So thanks everybody for subscribing and for watching it on YouTube. So Esther, it's been a good week. We had a couple of good stories. So there was something on media localization, very interesting company. We did a buyer feature on a company called HOOQ. Can you tell me a bit more about that?
Yeah, so interesting model. HOOQ is a video entertainment streaming service. So similar to Netflix model that we all know and love, but specifically for the Southeast Asian markets. So localization plays a big role in what they're doing. And I think from the buyer feature, we saw that they actually have quite a big return on investment when it comes to their localization efforts. So currently localizing into 6 or 7 languages across the region. They have a big focus on the Indian market, as you might expect. So they localize into 3 languages for India. And several others as well for Singapore and different markets as well.
Interesting company. Yeah, we did some research, and again, the company is called HOOQ, and it's actually a joint venture by Sony Pictures, Warner Brothers, and Singtel. And Singtel is the local Singaporean telecom provider, but it's a gigantic company, and they've invested all across the region. So it's very interesting that you see these types of players going into the streaming market, right? And in a sense, I would say the Singaporean consumer market is probably not their main target. I would assume that for them, it's really about going into, markets like Indonesia or India with, hundreds of millions of potential consumers. So what were the languages that they're dubbing and subbing their content into?
So I think we had a number of different languages. So there was Hindi for India, there was Bahasa, there was Malay, I think, and a number of different ones. Telugu,
okay.
But you know the languages there
a little
bit better than I do.
Okay, I don't know them by heart.
Like
what exactly? I think, we had 7 languages. So there were 3 for India, and then for Southeast Asia, I think it was Bahasa Indonesia, because there's 2 variants of Bahasa. So Bahasa actually means language, and one is for Malaysia, and the other one is for Indonesia. But I was told they're quite close. I don't understand much, despite having lived in Singapore for 3 years. And then they have Mandarin, which is obviously a language spoken in Singapore. I mean, generally for Singapore, it's a very interesting country linguistically speaking. They have 4 languages. English is widely spoken. Then they have Mandarin, Chinese, Mandarin Chinese. They have Tamil, and then Bahasa Melayu. So it's a quadrilingual country.
It's quite interesting as well, I think, specifically for this streaming market, the streaming platform, because, I mean, these are languages that typically some of the Western companies might actually struggle to find resources in. And also, if you think about in this region, I know that HOOQ is doing a lot of the Korean dramas, so potentially localizing from Korean into any number of those other languages that we've just named. So typically, we've heard from Netflix saying that they normally or sometimes use English as a pivot language between some of those. So interesting that you've got sort of the local on the ground knowledge of those languages and that setting as well. From HOOQ.
That's going to be a struggle or a challenge, not just operationally, i.e. trying to find resources for the language transition, let's say from Korean to Tamil, right? But also actually doing the actual translation and the adaptation. I mean, culturally, those are very, very different settings. So I find it fascinating that there is such a joint venture, right? Going up against the Netflix, the Disney, and of this world. So
I mean, it's potentially less of a surprise for Sony, for example. I mean, I'm not super surprised that they're involved, but I suppose the telco company, not necessarily a given. I wouldn't expect someone like British Telecom or whoever to go into streaming services necessarily in the UK. Although
yeah, they might be good at the streaming part, because I mean they're a telecom provider.
Oh, so yeah, super fast, broadband internet, whatever.
Should understand that component.
Marion, who wrote the article, actually mentioned that sometimes you can get free subscriptions to HOOQ with certain telco providers. So maybe they throw it in as a package if you sign up to a particular internet provider, for example.
Okay. Another topic we had, or we just published a story, about an hour ago, was Lionbridge facing a lawsuit. Very interesting case by the founders of a business they had acquired a lot earlier in 2015. So that company was called Geotext. It was a legal translation company. And the lawsuit is that the Geotext founders allege that they're owed additional payments from what is commonly referred to as an earnout. So when you're, let's go a little bit beyond the Lionbridge case, because it's only the initial lawsuit. There hasn't been any statement by Lionbridge. We didn't receive any comments from them. But generally, in such an earnout scenario, it's when you're selling your company. Sometimes there's an earnout component attached to it, which means that you're not getting the full price up front. So, for example, you're selling your company for a total of maybe $10 million, you're getting $7 million up front, and then the $3 million are contingent upon the business hitting certain targets later on. So they want to make sure you maybe retain some skin in the game, and there's a smooth handover. Somewhat common in the language industry, because there's a lot of small to medium sized companies where the founder may still play a pivotal role in running the business day to day, and may have not, even at the time of sale, may have not completely handed over all of the responsibilities. So as a buyer, you're keen to have these types of components. And also it's also somewhat common for larger deals, but then the percentages are typically a little lower, right? You want to get more cash up front. So let's see how that story plays out. Again, we requested comment, didn't receive any as of press time, as we like to put at the end of the article. But this is definitely a developing story. Who knows? Maybe they're going to settle eventually. Then we also ran a story on those ubiquitous translation scams. I mean, even I get some of these fake CVs. So tell us a bit more about that. Yeah,
so bane of everybody's life, especially if you're a vendor manager in an LSP. We covered a story talking about translation scammers. So typically these are people posing as the scams take multiple forms, but one of the typical common ones would be posing as a recruiter to solicit somebody's CV. So once you've got the CV of a reputable translator with all of the mentions of clients or projects or training, you can then switch out the email address, switch out the contact details for your own, or potentially create fake accounts, LinkedIn, email, etc., and then basically farm out those CVs to as many LSPs and as many potential translation buyers as you want. So apparently this is quite common and prevalent in the industry. It's not something that I personally have had a huge amount of experience with, but I think obviously if you're sort of on the vendor management side, potentially this is something that you really need to be aware of. So we actually covered a piece that was based on the Translator Scammers Directory. So they're a collective of people who prefer to remain anonymous. It's one of the only times that we actually refer to and quote from anonymous sources. They produce an annual report every year to report on how scams are progressing. Is it going up? Is it going down? What's the state of scamming in our industry? So they just released the 2019 report saying that actually they have noticed a slight increase in the number of scams being reported to them. So yeah, potentially, it's a challenge for everybody, and it's a challenge to know how to spot these CVs, and actually ward off against potential scams. I think the way that it actually works, so you might think, okay, well, that's not a very sustainable thing. Obviously, if you're posing as a translator and you're not a translator, how are you actually going to make any money out of that? I think what they do is that once they've solicited work from an LSP, they either would run the translation through some kind of free machine translation software and deliver it back to the LSP. They then request payment before the LSP or the end client has actually had a chance to complain potentially or flag that there might be an issue. That's one scenario. Or alternatively, the scammer might outsource it to a super low priced translator. Again, potentially not somebody who's qualified to be doing that work. And then, so in that case, they maybe would not even pay the person that they're outsourcing or subcontracting out to. So everybody, I mean, it's a threat to everybody. It's a problem for LSPs, it's a problem for translators as well, who potentially risk having their reputations damaged online or not being paid by these scammers as well.
Are you getting some of these CVs? Because I used to, but I think my spam filter's getting a little better. It's literally, it's so standardized. I mean, unless they really take the time to completely copy somebody else's CV and impersonate. Yeah, it's kind of a basic Word document format, and it's like, okay, it's got a very, I don't know, like the name of the person would be very specific to that country. Like, so, you know, it's like a
John Doe
from the USA, etc. Like, and the equivalent for that in Germany or Sweden. To me, it's very obvious that this would be a scam email. So probably it's a numbers game, right? You're sending out 1,000 of these. You might get lucky once, and it's somewhat automated. So they actually eventually end up making money. And I think from a trend point of view, they said it was a slight decrease in 2019. So it's not like an escalating problem, right? It's something that's been around for a long, long time.
Well, I think the trends have changed slightly. When you've got email that's available, when you've got all of these email domains and you've got LinkedIn, you've got various different platforms, I think it is becoming, and Twitter and things like that, I think it is becoming more widespread. But I know there was an example that we cited in the article that was to do with counteracting these scammers and potentially turning the tables on them and actually spamming their potential the email address that they're using. Once you've thought, okay, these are spammers, go back and spam them.
Well, that's funny.
That was one possible solution.
Do you know that super popular TED Talk where the guy was responding back to a scammer or spammer? You need to watch that. There's this 10 million views TED Talk where somebody I actually replied to a spammer and got in a conversation with them. It's super fun. It's like 10 minutes, and then he's walking people through the dialogue, and in the end, the scammer is really confused, and it was a hilarious TED Talk. You should probably watch that. It was really funny. We actually ran a poll in the newsletter, and we asked have you noticed an increase in attempted translation scamming using NMT or machine translation over the past 2 to 3 years? And half of them said yes, definitely, and another 15% said yes, but not much, and then the rest was like, nah, not really, because you mentioned, right, they just run it through machine translation. And this was harder to do 4 or 5 years ago because in many languages it was fairly obvious that this was empty output. And now, at a cursory glance, you might not immediately catch it, right? Yeah. And then, of course, there's the whole component of generally outsourcing for post-editing in the first place. So that would actually put a bit of a stop to that, because if you're outsourcing machine translation in the first place, for post-editing, that will kind of that'll impede that scam. So who knows?
Yeah, unless people aren't actually changing anything from the machine translation output. But I suppose that
is a big problem. Yeah, that is a big problem, and I'm talking to a lot of people at LSPs, and they're mentioning that it's hard to understand how long have people spent actually editing those files. And I think in terms of CAT tools going forward, that's definitely a feature that should be available, and that they're building into the tools, that you understand how long did somebody edit a segment, how much time did they spend editing the segment, what was the editing made, was it in depth, was it just kind of one
the value add, basically.
Yeah, the value add, that's probably some of the features they're working on at CAT tools right now.
Yeah.
I mentioned it in the last podcast as well. We have that product called Slater Sweep, where we're basically picking up on dozens of stories a day, and then some of them make it into our editorial coverage on the website. So this week we had a bunch of stories from the Consumer Electronics Show in Las Vegas, 2020, about what they call personal translators. And those earpieces, the gadgets, right? And we did run a few stories on those in the past, and it was so interesting when I googled a little bit around. There's a site called entrepreneur.com which called personal translators, among the 5 innovations that will dominate the Consumer Electronics Show 2020. I mean, obviously hyperbolic, but there were a bunch of those that were launched or marketed, and I always find it fascinating that people would actually buy this. I
suppose it depends where you are, though. If you're somewhere remote and you don't know anybody, maybe you take that as your modern day dictionary type thing.
No, it's actually you have an earpiece and then you talk, and it's live interpreting it. So I find it fascinating that you would buy a standalone device as opposed to just trying to get this through your iPhone.
Oh, okay, I see what you mean. Yeah. No, I get the software that is in demand, but potentially not in that format.
No, they actually have like actual earpieces. Look like kind of
like that, like what you're wearing.
Yeah, what I'm wearing. Yeah, the same thing. And last year we had there was an article by the New York Times. So we were contacted. Remember we were in San Francisco?
Yeah.
There was a New York Times correspondent that pinged us on Facebook, of all places, on our company Facebook account. And there were some back and forth. They did a couple of interviews with them, and then they published an article on those headpieces in November. That was a couple of months later. It was very interesting to also see how the New York Times does stories, right? It's a long process. Yeah. There's a number of editing processes involved, and eventually you get one quote out of like a 2-hour discussion, right?
And a link back, though.
And the link back, yeah, I appreciate that. That's obviously as a news site, that's gold if you get a link back from the New York Times. So I really appreciate that. We'll link the story in the show notes. So yeah, I mean that's. I wonder if these devices really have a future, given that everybody's super plugged into the phones. I mean the standalone devices, but they appear to be making headway. 3 years ago, I was like, okay, this is ridiculous. They're never going to make any money at all. But now they're among the 5 innovations that will dominate the consumer.
Yeah, there's certainly a lot of
electronics
hype,
show.
Isn't there? Yeah, there's a lot of hype from CES around these gadgets.
There is a lot of hype. All right, so circling back into the language industry, you mentioned last week that we're going to publish the M&A report. So how's that coming along?
It's progressing, yes, in the final stages, and we should be in a position to publish next week.
Well, looking forward to that. Really exciting. Yeah. It's a big one. This one is like 35, 40 pages.
Yeah, lots of information, lots of data. It's a good read.
Great. Yeah, that's it for now. Thanks for listening to number 4 of SlatorPod. Looking forward to having you around next week.
week.
Cheers. Bye-bye.
Bye.